Every indication Jinsey had was that Aspera was an unoccupied, uncolonized planet. It was off the beat track, not even rich in resources, hardly worth a second glance, which perhaps made it the perfect place for a secret political prison. But since it was uncolonized and off the beaten track, the question Jinsey kept asking himself was how was he to get there? He didn't have money to pay for passage on a ship, even if there had been a ship going there, let alone enough to charter his own vessel. Any attempt to enter the sector was likely to set off alarm bells. Surely it was carefully patrolled, and anyone coming close would be turned back. He spent a few days thinking about what to do. He dug up what information he could, but there was almost nothing to indicate that Aspera was anything but an uncolonized, inhospitable world. Through a stolen pass and unlocked terminal, behind closed doors in the port, and a little of his brother creative hacking, he managed to spend a few minutes with closed military records before being locked out enough to come away with the impression that there was something happening on the planet after all, though what exactly it was remained vague. Some indication that yes, there was a political prison there, but perhaps more than that, another project was hinted at, but remained very top secret. It was only referred to as Operation Aspera. At first, he thought that must be the name for the prison, but no, the prison was called simply and relatively unimaginatively Hell. Operation Aspera was something else, but figuring this out brought him no closer to figuring out how to get to the planet. It took a few days for it to hit him. If the planet was inhospitable, then nothing could grow there unless they had a hydroponic facility. But even so, they'd need other supplies, so there must be someone bringing supplies in every few months or so, maybe more often, maybe less. That had to be his way in. It was in any case the only possible way in he could think of. It would take another trip to the spaceport to Balaclave and the appropriation of a little more security clearance. He waited until the day shift was ending and then followed the security manager out of his office and forced him from behind into a supply closet where he gauged and bound him. He took the man's key cards, used them to get back into his office and onto a terminal. He had to go back and threaten the manager and his family to get the right passcodes, but in the end he was into the system. From there it took a while, but following what his brother had taught him, he cracked his way from there to the military side. He was there for just a moment before the system shut him out, but saw enough to find mention of the name of a freighter with security clearance for the sector where Aspera was to be found, the Iban. From there it was back to port records. He scanned through bills of lading for the Iban, found it making a trip to a classified location every 3 months or so, the last one a little over 2.5 months previous. That didn't give him much time. The cargo was as to be expected for a prison camp, food and medical supplies, vast quantities of water as well. But there was other cargo as well, specialized scientific equipment, computerware, surgical supplies. It was easy to locate the freighter. It was in a military berth, though, and well protected. He scanned the vid, listening to see if they were looking for crew. They weren't. From a terminal at his picker job, he could access past manifest for the Iban, including names and pictures of the crew. There were 2 freight specialists, basically glorified pickers, one of them a large Swede named Swanson, the other a smaller man named Talbot. Both were listed in the public directory. Swanson had a small apartment fairly near the spaceport, just a few blocks away from Jinsey's own place. Talbot lived on the far side of the dome. For a few days, Jinsey followed Talbot home from work, then hung around his place afterward to see where he went. He never seemed to go anywhere. From the street, Jinsey could see the blue light of the vid flickering on the walls around him. The man hardly seemed to have any sort of life, so he switched to Swanson, who went directly from the spaceport to a bar called the Meteor. Almost every night he would always take the same place at one end of the bar, easing his large body carefully down onto the narrow stool. He was apparently enough of a regular that the stool was always empty when he arrived. The first night, Jinsey took a stool around the corner of the bar, a few stools between him and Swanson. He waited until Swanson had ordered his beer and then nodded. The man crinkled his eyes at him in confusion and then nodded back. He watched Swanson order half a dozen beers, one about every 10 minutes or so, and then promptly, at the end of an hour, leave. Getting up, he waggled his way off the chair and slightly waviness to his stride, but basically okay. Jinsey considered following him home, but instead stayed where he was. The next time, Jinsey was already seated when Swanson arrived. He nodded once to the man, who nodded back and sat down. Jinsey waited until Swanson was nearly done with his 3rd beer and then got himself another beer, ordered a round for Swanson as well. The Swede nodded his thanks and quickly drained the glass, but Tintern said nothing to Jinsey, made no attempts to start a conversation, and just as before, after an hour had passed, he promptly stood and left, moving awkwardly and ponderously out the door. Later that evening, Jinsey began to think, what if this doesn't work? What sort of backup plan should I have? But he could think of no plan. If he wanted to get on board the Eben, this had to work. The third night, when Swanson came into the bar, Jinsey had already taken the stool beside his own. Swanson grunted once to him, nodded slightly, and then squeezed his way onto the stool. Jinsey ordered himself a beer and turned to Swanson. Want one too? He asked. You're paying? Asked Swanson. Sure, said Jinsey. Why not? Swanson nodded. The bartender brought them their beers, and they drank for a while in silence. Finally, Jinsey said, You're at the port? Swanson nodded. You too, he said. Jinsey nodded back. I'm a picker, he said. The big Swede crackled a smile. A picker, he said. That's no kind of life. No, what do you do? Freight too, said the Swede. Not that much different than a picker, but the pay's a lot better. He took a big sip of his drink, and for a moment Jinsey thought that was all he was going to say. He was afraid to push it. He didn't want to seem too eager. Indeed, it was all he did say for a while, through the end of his first beer and all the way through his second, until somewhere well into the middle of his third. You have to get on a ship going off planet, Swanson finally said, his speech slightly slurred now. Somewhere that wants you to load up and travel with the goods and then unload too. That's where the money is. Sounds good, said Jinsey. How do I go about it? Swanson shook his head. Have to just ask around, he said. Place I'm at is full. And where's that? The Eben, said Swanson. Nice ship. New, specialized. When do you ship out next? Jinsey asked. Swanson frowned. Week and a half, he said. More or less. That was as far as it went that night. The next night, though, Jinsey was back again buying the beer, and Swanson spoke a little more. Best pay comes with cargo. That you don't know much about, he said, and winked. At least that's what it seems like on the Eben. What do you mean you don't know much about it? Someone's got to know. Swanson waved one meaty hand. Oh, the captain, he probably knows something, he said, but us all we know are the basic categories listed on the bill of lading. Yes, but you're a picker, said Swanson, because, more loquacious. You just pick up the job at the beginning or the end. All you have to know is how fragile it is or isn't. We have to load the cargo and ride with it the whole way and unload it. Usual jobs, they give us pretty specific content listings so that we'll know what to do if something goes wrong. He swiveled on his bar stool until he was looking directly at Jinsey. His eyes, Jinsey saw, were slightly glazed. Something spills, say. Something goes wrong. It's good to know what you're carrying and whether it might blow up or explode or burn through the deck. But some of these jobs, he said, and took a drink. No, take that back. One job that we keep doing, they'll put a label on a box that says medical supplies, but when it accidentally gets knocked open, it isn't medical supplies at all, but sealed vats of some sort of acid. I ask you, how can that be a medical supply? So they're smugglers, said Jinsey. Swanson prodded Jinsey's chest with his forefinger. I didn't say that, he said. These are government men. They just don't want people to know where they're going and what they're prepared to do once they get there. But you've figured it out, said Jinsey. Swanson shook his head. No reason to figure it out, he said. Better just to go along with it and get paid. People who start trying to figure stuff like that out always end up in trouble, which is probably exactly where I'm headed, thought Jinsey. By the end of the week, they were more or less friends, with Swanson talking almost as much as an ordinary human, though prone to odd fits of silence as well. Several times Swanson slapped him on the back, said he was going to miss him once he shipped out. Maybe a spot will open up, said Jinsey. Swanson shook his head. It won't, he said, but if it does, I'll put in a good word for you. You're a picker, but I bet you could do it. Two choices, thought Jinsey as he waited in the bar the next day for Swanson to come in. Just 3 days before Swanson shipped out, he could do as his ordinary plan had suggested and simply drug Swanson, make him incapable of showing up for work. He had a twist of ground-up sleeping pills in his pocket that he could pour into the man's beer. It'd be enough to knock the Sweden out, maybe would make him sleepy for a few days, and then when he didn't show up for work, Jinsey could be there asking around for work, just happening to have a specialization in cargo. But he liked Swanson, that was the problem. Talbot, on the other hand, he hardly knew, and Swanson was likely to think to call on him if Talbot didn't show up for work. The odds were better, but the question was how to bring it smoothly about, and as ideas flitted back and forth within his head, he began to ask himself, how far am I willing to go for my brother? I'll break the law for him. I'll force someone out of their job just to have a chance to see him. What else will I do? Would I kill someone for him? He shook his head. No, he had to be careful. He couldn't let his quest for his brother, a quest for a brother who might now be damaged enough to not even recognize him if he were to find him, make him into a different person than he was. He couldn't let go of himself just to find his brother. That afternoon he quit his job. His boss was a little surprised and started to protest that he needed some notice, but in the end he sighed, counted out Jinsey's back pay, and shook his head. Goodbye. Jinsey went out and bought a roll of duct tape, then went to the apartment building where Talbot lived. He rang several bells until someone buzzed him in. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, the door a cheap affair, and by leaning into the door and jiggling the knob while forcing a card in, he managed to pop the lock out of its groove and go in. Inside, the apartment was immaculate, nothing out of place. 2 clean plates sat side by side on the counter with a knife and fork crossed over each in an X, with 2 glasses arranged in perfect symmetry above them. The cabinets were mostly empty, though one was full of identical cans of food. The bed was made, the bathroom exceptionally clean. In a way, it was hard to believe anybody lived there at all. He wandered around the apartment for a while thinking. In the office, he found a pen and a piece of paper and wrote, "Your next job," followed by the picking company's vid contact. Was that giving too much away, putting too much at risk? Maybe, but he'd had a hard enough life himself that he couldn't see himself taking away a man's livelihood, even a man as strange and repressed as Talbot. He left it on the kitchen table where it lay awkwardly, the only object in the apartment to seem out of place. By the time Talbot had come home from work and had opened the door, Jinsey had his balaclava on and was hiding behind it. The small man came through and Jinsey hit him hard, twice in the temple, quick, jabbing blows. Talbot gave a strange, breathless cry and fell in a heap. Jinsey dragged him over to a chair and tapped his arm and legs to it. When Talbot was secure, Jinsey poured a glass of water and sprinkled the twist of crushed sleeping tablets into it. He waited for the man to come around, but nothing seemed to be happening. He waited some more, then pulled a chair closer to him and placed his finger against his neck. No pulse. It seemed absurd, an accident of fate. He stripped off his balaclava and quickly unbound Talbot and laid him flat, tried to give him artificial respiration, pumped his chest, but it had been too long. The blood was already seeping lower in the body and pooling, leaving the face pale and waxen. He left the body and slumped into the couch, holding his head with his hands. It was his fault. He had hit the man too hard, or maybe just bad luck. Maybe Talbot had some sort of condition that he should have known about, a heart problem. Say, in any case, the first thing he should have done when the man went down was check his pulse and made sure he was still breathing. Now he had traded the chance of seeing his brother for another man's life. How many other lives would fall forfeit along the way? After a while he got up and removed the remaining duct tape from Talbot's arm and legs and from the chair. He dragged the man into the other room and positioned him in an armchair in front of his vid, then turned it on to one of the broadcasts. The body was already a little stiff, but it bent for him with a little pressure and settled into the chair. Maybe it would look like he died there. He carefully positioned the kitchen chair back where it had been at the table, then washed out the glass containing the water and crushed sleeping pills, arranging it back where it had been before. The note he tore into fourths and slipped into his pocket along with the twist of paper. He took one last look over the apartment and then, thinking there was nothing else he could do, left. The next morning he was down at the port early, ostensibly to see Swanson off. The big man, upon seeing him, came over and swatted his shoulder with his big hand. "No more drinking together, Ed," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Now you'll have to drink alone." He introduced Jinsey to Captain Martin, who shook his hand. "My friend Jinsey," Swanson said, "one of the best pickers there is, but ready to move on to more serious freight. Keep him in mind if you ever have an open position." Captain Martin just nodded and made small talk for a moment, and then went back to making preparations and overseeing the loading of the shuttles that would take them up to the Ebon, currently in orbit. Swanson shook his hand again and then left. Jinsey hung around a little bit more and then, not wanting to seem too needy or conspicuous, went home. The next few hours were hard ones as he waited by the vid for them to contact him. What if they didn't? What if they had someone else in mind, or simply decided that they could manage without an additional person to take Talbot's place? Then Talbot would have died for no reason, and Jinsey would have gotten no further toward figuring out how to see his brother. He imagined the captain, or perhaps Swanson, or perhaps someone else, realizing that Talbot wasn't there, then trying to call him by vid, then sending someone running toward his place to check on him, and finding the dead body. Would it seem that he had died of natural causes? Would there be a suspicious bruise on his temple where Jinsey had struck him? An hour went by, then two, without word. He was close to giving up and abandoning it altogether when the vid flicked on and he saw the captain's face. He accepted the connection. "Mr. Jinsey Sato," the captain said. "Yes," said Jinsey. "Didn't know that I'd find you at home," he said, "but here you are." "Swing shift today," Jinsey lied, hoping they hadn't managed to track down which picker he worked for, and discovered that he had quit. I go in a few minutes." "Maybe not," said the captain. "How'd you like to come work for me?" "Work for you?" he said. "Sure," and then felt he had to backtrack and ask, "What's the pay?" The captain gave him a figure that was nearly double his picking job. "You come highly recommended by Swanson," he said. "I trust his judgment. Only catch is that you'd have to start today." Jinsey pretended to think about it, then nodded. "What time do you want me in?" he asked. "Immediately. We're already in orbit and waiting for you. There's a shuttle waiting in the port. Pack your things and catch it right away. No delay now. We'll leave as soon as you get up here." He nodded and cut the vid. He took a deep breath. He was one step closer to seeing his brother.